Hey, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we're diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery, smart, sharp, and worth every minute. The orchids were behaving themselves that Tuesday morning, which was more than I could say for the woman sitting across from my desk. Her name was Celia Barrow, and she had called at 9:15, requesting an appointment with Nero Wolfe on a matter of, quote, extreme urgency and considerable delicacy. I had told her, as I always tell them, that Wolfe received visitors between 11 and 1, and again after 4, and that she was welcome to present herself at the Brownstone on West 35th Street at any time within those hours. She had arrived at 11 on the dot, which told me something. People who arrive exactly on time are either disciplined or desperate. Looking at Celia Barrow, I was putting my money on desperate. She was somewhere north of 40 and south of 50, dressed in the kind of understated elegance that costs real money and works hard to pretend it doesn't. Dark hair pulled back with precision, pearls that weren't pretending to be anything they weren't, hands folded in her lap with a stillness that she had clearly rehearsed on the cab ride over. Her eyes, however, were not cooperating with the rest of the performance. They moved, they checked the door, they assessed the room, and then assessed me, and then went back to the door again. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "I would prefer to speak directly with Mr. Wolfe." "Mr. Wolfe," I said pleasantly, "will be down from the plant rooms at 11 sharp. He spends his mornings with his orchids. In the meantime, you can tell me what brings you here, which will save time, or you can sit and admire the decor, which will not. I'd recommend the former." She considered this. The hands in her lap tightened slightly, and then relaxed. "My nephew has disappeared," she said. "Randolph Barrow. He is 26 years old, the sole heir to the Barrow manufacturing fortune, and he has not been seen or heard from in 11 days. Have you gone to the police?" "I have." The word came out clipped, like she was biting off something unpleasant. "They have been unhelpful. They suggest he is an adult, who has chosen to absent himself. They have found no evidence of foul play." She paused. "I believe they are wrong." I reached for my notebook. Old habit. Wolfe reads my notes the way some men read the morning paper, thoroughly, and with strong opinions about the quality of the reporting. "What makes you think so?" "Randolph was to receive formal control of the Barrow Trust on his 27th birthday. That is in 19 days. She let that sit in the air between us for a moment. He would not walk away from $43 million. I wrote the number down. It had a pleasant weight to it on the page. "Who else had an interest in that trust?" I asked. Before she could answer, I heard the elevator. Wolfe keeps it slow and steady, which suits him perfectly. Celia Barrow heard it too, and her entire posture shifted. The rehearsed composure reasserted itself. Shoulders back, chin level, hands refolded. She was preparing to perform. That told me something else about her. She had come here with a version of the truth, already edited and polished, and she wanted to deliver it to the organ grinder, not the monkey. I didn't take it personally. In this business, it comes with the territory. Nero Wolfe entered the office the way he always does, deliberately, with the full weight of his 1/7 frame distributed across the floor, in a manner that somehow manages to suggest both great dignity and profound irritation at the necessity of locomotion. He was wearing his yellow smock over a dark suit, which meant he had come directly from the plant rooms, without stopping to change, which was unusual. It meant he had been listening on the house phone. He settled into the reinforced chair behind his desk, with the care of a man arranging something precious, touched the button that brought the small lever on the desk surface to his preferred angle, and looked at Celia Barrow. "Madam," he said, "you wish to find your nephew." "I do," she said. "You believe he is dead?" Celia Barrow's composure cracked, just slightly, at the corner of the right eye, a tightening, not a tear. "I believe that is a possibility I cannot afford to ignore." Wolfe laced his fingers across the magnificent architecture of his midsection. "You said $43 million, which Archie has dutifully recorded. Who inherits the trust if Randolph Barrow does not survive to his 27th birthday? She had prepared for this question. I could tell because she answered it just a hair too quickly. The trust disperses in equal thirds, she said. To myself, to Barrow Manufacturing's board of directors as a charitable endowment, and to Randolph's father's business partner, a man named Gerald Fitch. And if Randolph survives to his birthday and takes control of the trust, then the dispersal clauses become void. The money is entirely his. And your share becomes nothing. She said it without apparent emotion, which was itself an emotion. Wolfe was quiet for a moment. His eyes drifted to the arrangement of Cattleya on the shelf to his left. 3 blooms, 2 white, 1 faintly lavender, which Fritz had cut that morning from the greenhouse. He looked at them the way other men look at a good argument, with appreciation and mild possessiveness. "Tell me about Randolph," he said at last. Celia Barrow had clearly prepared a description, because what came out was organized and slightly bloodless, like a character reference for a job application. Randolph was intelligent, she said, educated at Columbia, had worked in the company's Midtown office for 2 years since graduation, learning the business, was serious, disciplined, not prone to impulse, had a small circle of friends, one close friend in particular, a young man named Marcus Dent, who worked as an architect in the city. Did he have enemies? Wolfe asked. He was about to inherit a great deal of money, she said. In my experience, that is sufficient. Lovers? She hesitated. There was a young woman. Eleanor Voss. She worked in the accounts division of Barrow Manufacturing for about a year. She was let go approximately 4 months ago. Let go by whom? Another hesitation, fractionally longer. By me. I oversee human resources at the company in an administrative capacity. Was the separation amicable? It was professional, she said, which was not an answer. I was writing steadily. Wolfe was watching her with the particular quality of attention he brings to interrogations. Not sharp, not probing, just utterly present, like a very large and patient animal that is not in any hurry and does not need to be. The night Randolph was last seen, Wolfe said. What do you know of it? He had dinner with Gerald Fitch at a restaurant on East 52nd Street. A regular arrangement. They met for dinner on the first Monday of each month, a tradition from Randolph's father's time. Fitch says they parted at approximately 10:15. Randolph's apartment is in the East 70s. He never arrived. You know he never arrived? His doorman confirmed it, and his housekeeper found the apartment exactly as she had left it the previous Friday. Nothing disturbed, no sign of habitation over the weekend. Wolfe closed his eyes. This is not a sign of inattention. It is, I have come to understand over years of watching him do it, a sign of the opposite. He was filing things, sorting, placing Celia Barrow's carefully prepared account into whatever internal architecture he uses for these things. You are withholding something, he said, eyes still closed. Celia Barrow's hands came unfolded and refolded in her lap. I beg your pardon? You came here because the police have done nothing. You believe the police have done nothing because they have concluded your nephew left of his own accord. You disagree. But you have not told me why you disagree with such certainty, beyond your estimate of his character. He opened his eyes. There is something specific. You have chosen not to share it. I would like you to reconsider that choice. The room was very quiet. Outside on 35th Street, a truck rumbled past and faded. Celia Barrow reached into her handbag and produced an envelope. She set it on the edge of my desk. Not Wolfe's desk, mine, which meant she had positioned herself between us carefully and was still trying to control the flow of information. I picked it up. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper. The handwriting on it was precise and angular, the kind developed by someone who had been taught penmanship as a serious discipline. I read it and handed it across to Wolfe. He read it. His expression didn't change. It never does. The note read, "They won't let me reach the birthday. If something happens to me, start with Fitch, but don't trust Aunt Celia either. When did you receive this? Wolfe asked. 10 days ago, she said. The day after he disappeared. It was mailed? Yes, from a box in Midtown, the postmark shows. So he was alive the day after the dinner with Fitch. Apparently. And he did not trust you, Wolfe said, pleasantly, and without any apparent intent to wound. Yet you have brought this to me. Why? Celia Barrow met his gaze with a steadiness that cost her something. Because whatever Randolph thinks of me, he is my brother's son. And because if Gerald Fitch has done something to that boy, I intend to see him answer for it. Wolfe looked at her for a long moment. Then, he looked at me. I gave him the small nod that means, she believes what she's saying, but she's still not giving us everything. He turned back to her. My fee for a case of this complexity begins at $10,000, he said. Archie will discuss the retainer. I will require the names and contact information for Gerald Fitch, Marcus Dent, and Eleanor Voss. I will also require access to whatever correspondence of Randolph's you have available, and the name of the restaurant where he dined with Fitch on the evening of his disappearance. He picked up his book from the desk, a thick volume on Byzantine economic history, which he had been working through for 2 weeks, and opened it. I do not leave this house. Archie will conduct whatever physical investigation proves necessary. We will begin this afternoon. Celia Barrow blinked. For a woman in rigid control of herself, it was the equivalent of a gasp. That's all? She said. For now, Wolfe said without looking up from the page. It is sufficient. I showed her out, took the retainer check, and came back to find Wolfe still reading, or pretending to. She wrote the note herself, I said, settling into my chair. Is that where you're going? I am going nowhere, Archie. I never do. He turned a page. But yes, the note is a possibility worth examining. A woman who fires her nephew's lover 4 months before his inheritance vests, then appears at our door with a document, casting suspicion on his business associate, while noting that she herself is not to be trusted. She is either the most honest client we have ever had, or the most clever. You think it's the latter? I think it is too early to think anything. He looked up finally, and fixed me with the expression I've come to regard as his version of enthusiasm, a slight narrowing of the eyes. I think a young man wrote a frightened note from somewhere in the city 10 days ago, and has not been heard from since. I think several people had strong financial reasons to wish him harm. I think you have 4 names to chase, and a restaurant to visit. He returned to Byzantine economics. I suggest you begin with Gerald Fitch. The dinner is the last confirmed moment. That makes Fitch the last confirmed person. Right, I said. I stood, reached for my jacket and hat. And if he doesn't want to talk to me? Wolfe turned another page. Persuade him, he said. You are adequately equipped for the purpose. I went out into the mid-morning light of West 35th Street, where the city was doing its usual imitation of controlled chaos, and thought about a young man with $43 million and 19 days to live, who had mailed a fighting note to an aunt he didn't trust. Whatever had happened to Randolph Barrow, it had started at that dinner table on East 52nd Street. I flagged a cab and went to find out what Gerald Fitch remembered about the evening. My guess was that he remembered it very well indeed. Gerald Fitch ran his office the way some men run their personalities, impressively on the surface, with a suggestion of serious structural problems underneath. His suite occupied the 14th floor of a building on Park Avenue, all glass and chrome, and the kind of leather furniture that announces wealth without quite achieving taste. The receptionist had cheekbones and a manner that suggested she had been selected for both, and she regarded my card with the particular blend of suspicion and curiosity that Wolfe's name tends to produce in people who have heard of him and aren't sure whether that's good news. I had called ahead. Fitch had agreed to see me, which was interesting. Either he had nothing to hide, or he had so much to hide that refusing would look worse than talking. In my experience, it's usually the second. He came out to meet me himself, which people of his financial weight rarely do. Gerald Fitch was 61, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of tan that comes from a boat rather than a beach chair, and silver hair worn short, and precisely. He had a handshake that was doing too much work, firm to the point of performance, held a half-second too long. A man trying to establish something. "Mr. Goodwin," he smiled. It was a practice smile, the kind developed over decades of negotiations. "I understand you're working for Celia Barrow." "I'm working for Nero Wolfe," I said. "Who is working for a client. You know why I'm here." "Randolph." The smile modulated into something more appropriate. "Concern, or a convincing version of it. Come in." His private office had a view of the park, and a desk the size of a small aircraft carrier. He gestured me toward a chair, and took his own. On the credenza behind him I could see a framed photograph. A much younger Fitch with his arm around a man I assumed was the late Howard Barrow, Randolph's father. Both men were laughing. Neither was being careful. "Tell me about the dinner," I said. "I've told the police." "Now tell me." He settled back in his chair, measuring me. Whatever he was measuring, he apparently decided I was someone who would get the answer eventually anyway. "We met at Brasserie Laurent. First Monday of every month, Howard and I used to do the same thing. After Howard died, I kept it up with Randolph. Tradition matters." "What did you talk about?" "Business, mostly. The trust handover. Randolph had been doing good work in the office. Better than I expected, frankly. He was serious about the company. We talked about the investment portfolio, some decisions he'd be inheriting, a real estate position that needed attention." "Did he seem worried about anything?" A pause. Not long. Fitch was too practiced for long pauses, but present. He seemed preoccupied. I attributed it to the upcoming transition. Taking control of that kind of wealth at 26 is not nothing. "Preoccupied how? Quiet? Distracted?" "He asked me a question," Fitch said slowly, as though he'd decided to give me this, "that I've been thinking about since. He asked me whether I had ever had any reason to doubt his father's business judgment." I kept my face neutral. "What did you say?" "I said Howard was the best businessman I ever knew, which is true." He paused again. Randolph nodded, but he didn't seem satisfied. Then he changed the subject. "What time did you leave the restaurant?" "Just after 10. I put him in a cab, we shared one down Park, and I got out at 63rd. He continued north." "Did the cab take him to his building?" "I assume so. I didn't watch it go." He met my eyes steadily. "Mr. Goodwin, I want to find Randolph. Whatever you may have been told about the trust arrangement. Yes, I'm aware of my inheritance position. I'd trade every cent of it to know that boy is safe. Howard Barrow was the closest friend I had. Finding out something happened to his son on my watch would be—" He stopped himself. His jaw tightened briefly. "I would like you to find him." I studied him for a moment. He was giving me the right words, and delivering them well. The question was whether the right words were the true words. "Who else knew about the dinner?" I asked. It was a standing arrangement. Anyone close to Randolph or to the company would have known. "Including Celia Barrow?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the photograph on the credenza and then back to me. When he spoke, his voice had shifted slightly, quieter and more precise. "Celia has always had her own interests in that trust. I'm not suggesting anything specific. I'm suggesting that you should look carefully at whatever she tells you." "She said the same thing about you," I told him. For the first time, his expression showed something that wasn't managed. A brief, almost involuntary flash of something. Not surprise exactly. Acknowledgement, maybe. As if the situation were playing out in a way he recognized, but hadn't quite expected to witness. "Of course she did," he said quietly. "I found Marcus Dent at an architecture firm on the west side. A wide-open studio floor full of drafting tables and models in various states of construction, presided over by the smell of paper and ink. He was at a desk near the windows, a thin young man with an open, intelligent face and the look of someone who had been sleeping badly. When I introduced myself, he stood up and said, 'Thank God, someone is actually doing something.' He was 27, 3 years older than Randolph. They had been close since Columbia. He described Randolph with the kind of unguarded warmth that you can't perform well. It came out in specifics, rather than adjectives. He always ordered the same thing at restaurants, first visit or 50th. He had 3 copies of the same sweater, in different colors. He was the most stubborn person I have ever met, about being on time. When did you last see him? The Sunday before he disappeared. We had lunch. He was worried, I guess. He'd been doing research into the company's older records, his father's papers. He wouldn't tell me exactly what he'd found, but he said he thought someone had been stealing from the trust for years. That sat in the air for a moment. I wrote it down. Did he say who? He said he wasn't sure. He said it was complicated. Marcus hesitated, then pushed on. He said the trail was cleaner than it should be. Like someone who knew exactly where to look, had already been through, and tidied up. That scared him more than the money part. Did he say anything about Gerald Fitch? He said Fitch was either innocent or very good at being innocent, and he didn't know which. Marcus looked at me directly. You should talk to Eleanor Voss. She worked in accounts at Barrow Manufacturing for about a year. She and Randolph were close, and she was fired abruptly, for no real reason that anyone could see. Randolph was furious about it. Furious at whom? At his aunt. He never said it directly, but it was obvious. He paused. If Randolph told anyone what he'd found, it would have been Eleanor. She was meticulous. She noticed things. I think maybe that's why Celia Barrow let her go. Eleanor Voss lived in a walk-up apartment in Murray Hill, on a block that was doing its best with limited resources. She opened the door with the chain on, looked at my card through the gap, and then opened it fully. She was mid-20s, with dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a manner that was cautious, without being hostile, the manner of someone who has learned to assess situations before committing to them. I heard Wolfe's name before, she said, leading me into a small, book-crowded living room. Randolph mentioned him once. Said if he ever got into real trouble, that was the name. He did get into real trouble, I said. I know. She sat down and folded her arms across her chest, not defensively, but as though holding herself together. I've been waiting for 11 days for someone to tell me he's all right. You're not here to tell me that. Not yet, I said. Tell me about the company records. She was a good witness. Clear, organized, and specific, which made sense for someone who had spent a year in accounts. She had noticed the irregularities herself, she said, about 7 months into her time at Barrow Manufacturing. Small discrepancies in the quarterly reconciliation of the Trust Investment Fund. Amounts that had been adjusted, documented, and redocumented. The paperwork impeccably maintained in a way that drew the eye if you were looking for gaps rather than figures. She had brought it to Randolph's attention quietly. He had taken it seriously. How much, I asked. I estimated approximately $2 million over 8 years, give or take. Small enough not to trigger audits, consistent enough to be a pattern. She looked at her hands. I was fired 3 weeks after I started asking questions. By Celia Barrow. Officially, yes. Performance review, restructuring, the usual language. But the timing was precise. She looked up. I didn't have enough to go to anyone with. Randolph said he was going to build a proper case. He was going to wait until the trust transferred, and then he'd have the access to prove it. Which meant, I said, that whoever was responsible had 19 days to do something about him before he turned 27. Eleanor Voss nodded once. Her jaw was set, and her dark eyes behind the wire frames were bright with something that was not quite tears and not quite anger, but somewhere between them. Mr. Goodwin, she said, please find him. I drove back across town to the brownstone as the afternoon light started going amber between the buildings. Wolfe would be back in the office from his 4 o'clock hour in the plant rooms. I had a notebook full of names and contradictions, a missing heir, a dinner that was the last confirmed moment, and a $2 million discrepancy that someone had carefully constructed, and someone else had begun to unravel. 4 people, I thought. Celia Barrow, who fired the woman who found the evidence. Gerald Fitch, who was last with Randolph and stood to inherit. Marcus Dent, who knew what Randolph was looking for and had told no one for 11 days. And Eleanor Voss, who had been removed from the picture at exactly the right moment, and was either the most sympathetic victim in the case or the most carefully positioned one. Wolfe was going to want to talk to all of them. I went in to report, and found him in the office, working on a plate of Fritz's cheese soufflé, with the concentration of a man engaged in an important intellectual exercise. "Well," he said, without looking up. "Randolph Barrow thought someone was embezzling from his trust," I said. "Approximately $2 million over 8 years. He was building evidence. He had 19 days before he could prove it." Wolfe set down his fork. He looked at me with full attention. "Sit down, Archie," he said. "Tell me everything." I sat down, opened my notebook, and told him everything. He listened with his eyes half closed, occasionally murmuring a syllable, occasionally asking a question that was really a scalpel disguised as a word. By the time I finished, Fritz had removed the plate, and the evening light was pressing against the office windows. "We will need them here," Wolfe said at last. "All 4, tomorrow afternoon. They may not come willingly. Then you will make the alternative appear less pleasant than attendance." He picked up his book. "Starting with Fitch. He knows more than he said, and he said more than he intended. The gap between those 2 things is where we will find something useful." I made a note to make 4 phone calls in the morning. Outside, New York went about its business, indifferent as always to the specific problems of any given Tuesday. Somewhere in the city, or perhaps not in the city at all, was a young man who had started asking the wrong questions at exactly the right time, and had then vanished before anyone could answer them. 19 days had become 8. The body turned up on Wednesday morning, which saved everyone the trouble of pretending Randolph Barrow had gone on vacation. A maintenance worker found him in the service stairwell of a parking garage on East 54th Street, 2 blocks from Brasserie Laurent, where he had eaten his last meal with Gerald Fitch 11 days prior. The medical examiner's preliminary finding, which Inspector Kramer relayed to me with his customary blend of professional efficiency and personal irritation, was blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, consistent with a single strike from a heavy, smooth-edged object that had not been recovered. Time of death, based on decomposition and temperature records, was placed between 10 and midnight on the Monday he disappeared. Kramer called me at 8:15. I was on my second cup of coffee and my first cigarette of the morning, going through my notes from the previous day. I listened to everything he said, asked 3 questions, got partial answers to 2 of them, and went directly upstairs to interrupt Wolfe's morning. He does not appreciate this. The morning belongs to the orchids, and the orchids, in Wolfe's world, take precedence over most things up to and including the collapse of Western civilization. I knocked on the door of the plant room, opened it without waiting for an answer, a liberty I take perhaps twice a year when the situation genuinely demands it, and walked into the warm, humid air that smells of earth and growth and the specific satisfaction Wolfe feels in that room and nowhere else. He was at the far end, misting a row of Miltoniopsis with the hand sprayer, his yellow smock slightly damp at the sleeves. Theodore Horstman, his orchid nurse, was at the potting bench, and looked at me with the expression of a man witnessing a minor desecration. "Randolph Barrow is dead," I said. "They found him this morning in a parking garage on East 54th, 2 blocks from the restaurant. He's been there since the night he disappeared." Wolfe set down the mister with great deliberateness. He looked at a pale yellow Miltoniopsis for a moment, as though confirming it had heard and would carry on without him. "Come downstairs," he said. In the office, with coffee in front of both of us, Fritz, who reads the atmosphere of the brownstone the way a ship's captain reads weather, had it ready before we sat down. Wolfe listened to the full account. Location, condition, probable time of death, the 2-block radius from the restaurant, the absence of the weapon. Kramer's people are working it as a robbery, I said. Wallet was empty. Watch was gone. The wallet and watch are misdirection, Wolfe said immediately. A man walking from a dinner engagement to a taxicab does not enter a parking garage stairwell voluntarily. He was taken there, or he was induced to go there, and then he was killed. Removing his wallet and watch was an afterthought, designed to complicate the question of motive. Agreed, which means the killer knew where to find him. Yes, Wolfe drank coffee, set down the cup, folded his hands. The cab. Fitch said he and Randolph shared a cab south on Park, and that Fitch departed at 63rd, while Randolph continued north. If this is true, Randolph was alive at 63rd Street. The restaurant is on 52nd. The garage is on 54th. He did not continue north in that cab. He went back. Or was never in the cab at all. Wolfe looked at me. Elaborate. Fitch says he put Randolph in a cab. We have Fitch's word for that. We have no cab driver, no receipt, no witness. If Fitch is lying about the cab, then Randolph never left that block alive. A possibility, Wolfe conceded. But Randolph's note, mailed the following day from a Midtown box, establishes that he survived the dinner. Unless, he paused, unless the note was mailed by someone else, someone who had access to his handwriting, or had obtained a pre-written note from him. I had not gotten that far yet. I got there now, and it was not a comfortable destination. If the note was mailed by the killer to create a timeline, then the killer is someone Randolph trusted enough to have written to beforehand, or someone who took the note from him during or after the attack. Wolfe picked up his coffee again. We are dealing with a person of deliberate intelligence. The embezzlement was meticulous. The crime scene was staged. The timeline was managed. This is not impulsive violence, Archie. This was planned. Planned by someone who knew about the dinner, which, as Fitch himself noted, was a standing monthly arrangement, known to anyone close to Randolph or the company. Celia Barrow knew. Gerald Fitch was present. Marcus Dent was a close friend. Eleanor Voss had been involved with Randolph for months. But there is a more specific question. The embezzlement. Randolph was building a case. He had begun with the company's older records, working toward proof. Who knew how close he was? Eleanor Voss knew he was looking. Marcus Dent knew he'd found something, but not the details. And whoever was doing the embezzling knew their tracks were being followed. Yes, Wolfe's eyes were at the middle distance, which is where he keeps his best thinking. The killer's primary motive was the embezzlement, not the inheritance. The inheritance was secondary, a convenient consequence. Our killer is not simply impatient for money. Our killer is frightened. Randolph was 11 days away from assuming full control of the trust and its records. The killer had 11 days to act before total exposure, which means it's someone who embezzled the money, or someone protecting the person who did. I turned that over. Protecting someone who embezzled from a trust. That opened a door I hadn't considered fully yet. Fitch and Celia Barrow, I said. One of them was embezzling. The other one found out, and instead of turning them in, they became complicit, Wolfe said, whether through shared benefit, shared guilt, or simple blackmail of the inverted kind. The knowledge itself becomes the bond. He rose from his chair, which is always a production and always worth watching. I will need them here, all four, this afternoon if you can arrange it. Tell them it concerns new information about Randolph's death. They've heard he's dead by now. It'll be all over the news by noon. Good. Fear is a productive condition in people who have things to hide. Let them have a few hours of it. He moved toward the doorway, then stopped. Call Inspector Kramer as well. Tell him I have information relevant to the investigation. He will come because he cannot afford not to, and because some vestigial part of him still expects me to be useful. He won't like being in the same room as the suspects. He never does, Wolfe said. It is one of the few pleasures the arrangement reliably provides. I made the calls. Celia Barrow agreed immediately, in a voice scraped hollow by whatever the morning's news had done to her. Gerald Fitch took 4 minutes, and a specific mention of what the alternative might look like, before he agreed. Marcus Dent said yes before I finished asking, and arrived 20 minutes early, which I mention only because it tells you something about the state of his nerves. Eleanor Voss was the last call, and the quietest conversation. She listened, said she'd come, and hung up without another word. Kramer arrived at 2. He is a big man, Inspector Kramer, broad, brick-colored, with a cigar that appears in his mouth at irregular intervals without being lit, like a prop he occasionally remembers he's carrying. He came in as the others were settling in the office, looked at the assembled group with the expression of a man arriving at a party he hadn't agreed to attend, and took the chair I indicated near the door. "Wolfe," he said. "Inspector," Wolfe said, "thank you for coming. I believe you will find the afternoon instructive." "I always do," Kramer said, without warmth. "I also always find it annoying." "Yes, well." Wolfe settled back in his chair and surveyed the room. The 4 of them made an interesting composition. Celia Barrow had placed herself in the red leather chair, the client's chair, as though asserting primacy. Gerald Fitch sat to her left, maintaining a careful 18 inches of social distance from her, which was more than the furniture arrangement required. Marcus Dent was on the small sofa, knees slightly apart, hands clasped, the posture of someone determined to project steadiness they didn't quite feel. Eleanor Voss had taken the straight-back chair near the bookshelves, slightly apart from the others, her glasses reflecting the afternoon light from the window. "I have asked you here," Wolfe said, without preamble, "because a young man is dead who should not be dead, and because the truth of the matter is present in this room. Not all of it, perhaps, but enough of it. I intend to find the remainder." He paused. "I will begin with a statement of what I believe to be established. Randolph Barrow was killed on the evening of Monday the 11th, between 10 o'clock and midnight, in the stairwell of a parking garage on East 54th Street. He was struck from behind by a single blow from a blunt object. His wallet and watch were removed after death, not before. The staging was intended to suggest robbery. It did not succeed, because a robber would have struck in the street and fled, not induced his victim into an enclosed stairwell. The room was very still. Kramer had his unlit cigar in one corner of his mouth, and was watching Wolfe with the fixed attention of a man who resents being impressed. Furthermore, Wolfe continued, Randolph Barrow had been investigating financial irregularities within the Barrow Manufacturing Trust. A pattern of small withdrawals, carefully documented and redocumented, amounting to approximately $2 million over 8 years. He had not yet assembled complete proof, but he was building toward it. His 27th birthday, 19 days from his death, would have given him full access to all trust records and the authority to commission a formal audit. He looked around the room. Someone in a position to conduct or conceal that embezzlement had 19 days to act. They used 11 of them. Gerald Fitch said carefully, "You're suggesting one of us." "I am not suggesting," Wolfe said. "I am establishing a framework. Within that framework, there are questions to which I do not yet have satisfactory answers. I intend to ask them now." He turned his gaze to Fitch directly. "Mr. Fitch, the cab." Fitch blinked. "What about it?" "You stated that you and Randolph shared a cab north on Park Avenue, and that you disembarked at 63rd Street," while he continued. "No cab driver has been located who remembers this fare. No receipt exists. The restaurant does not have exterior camera coverage of the departure area." He paused. "Did you in fact share a cab with Randolph Barrow that evening?" The silence that followed was of a specific quality. Not empty, but dense, full of calculation. Fitch was deciding something. I watched his face and counted internally. He got to 4 before he decided. "We walked out together," he said. "We stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes. I hailed a cab. Randolph said he was going to walk. He said he wanted air. He sometimes did that. He glanced at Celia Barrow. I should have said so from the beginning. I didn't, because I didn't want it to seem as though I'd simply left him there. But you did, Wolfe said. You left him standing on East 52nd Street at approximately 10:15. Yes. Which means Randolph Barrow was alone and on foot 2 blocks from where he was killed. Yes. Fitch's voice had lost its boardroom authority. What was left was quieter and older. Yes. Kramer shifted in his chair. His cigar moved. He was making notes on the small pad he keeps in his breast pocket, and he was not pleased, which meant he was getting something useful, which meant he was going to be difficult about acknowledging it later. Wolfe turned his gaze away from Fitch and let it travel, unhurried, across the remaining faces in the room. The note, he said, mailed the day after Randolph's death, written in his hand, warning of danger and casting suspicion in 2 directions simultaneously. He folded his hands. I would very much like to know who mailed that note. The afternoon light fell across the office in long bands, and outside the brownstone, the city pressed on, without interest in any of it. In the red leather chair, Celia Barrow sat very still. In the straight-backed chair by the bookshelves, Eleanor Voss had taken off her glasses and was cleaning them with the corner of her sleeve. And her face, without the frames, was younger and more frightened than I had seen it. And on the small sofa, Marcus Dent had stopped clasping his hands and pressed them flat against his knees, and was staring at the floor as though it owed him an explanation. The first crack in the story was opening. It wasn't large yet, but in my experience, once Wolfe finds the first crack, the rest follows in its own time. We had 11 days of truth left to excavate. He was warming up. Wolfe does not interrogate the way they do it in the movies. No bright lights, no raised voices, no table thumping. His method is more like watching a very patient man dismantle a clock. He removes one piece at a time, examines it, sets it aside, moves to the next. The mechanism keeps running right up until the moment it doesn't, and by then he knows exactly which part was defective. He started with Celia Barrow. Madam, he said, in the same tone he might use to begin a discussion about a book he'd been reading. You fired Eleanor Voss 4 months ago. You cited performance issues. Miss Voss disputes this characterization. I would like you to tell me the true reason. Celia Barrow had reassembled her composure in the minutes since Fitch's admission about the cab. She was formidable, I'll give her that. I am not obliged to discuss internal personnel decisions in a room full of— You are not obliged to discuss anything, Wolfe agreed pleasantly. You are also not obliged to be believed. Jury selection, as it were, has already begun. Inspector Kramer is watching you. Kramer, who had not moved, performed a small confirmatory gesture with his cigar. Celia Barrow looked at him. Whatever she saw there resolved something. Miss Voss was asking questions about the trust accounts that were outside the scope of her position, she said, each word measured and placed with care. It created tension with other staff. I considered it disruptive. She was asking questions about irregularities, Wolfe said, discrepancies she had found in the quarterly reconciliation. Questions that were, as it turned out, entirely legitimate. I was not aware of any legitimate basis for her inquiries. Were you not? It was not a question. Wolfe said it the way you might note that the weather was cold, observationally, without heat. Miss Voss, you have heard Mrs. Barrow's account. Does it correspond with your recollection of the circumstances of your departure? Eleanor Voss had replaced her glasses. She looked at Celia Barrow across the room with an expression that was precise and entirely without drama. Mrs. Barrow called me into her office, she said, and told me that certain questions I had been raising about the reconciliation records were causing concern. She said that I appeared to lack the discretion necessary for a position of financial trust. She suggested that I submit my resignation. When I asked her specifically which of my questions had caused concern, She did not answer. She paused. I didn't resign. She let me go the following week. The questions you were raising, Wolfe said, did you share them with Randolph Barrow before your departure? Yes. I had already told Randolph what I'd found. That's why he continued looking after I left. Wolfe nodded and turned to Gerald Fitch. Mr. Fitch, you have been associated with Barrow Manufacturing since its founding, as Howard Barrow's partner. You have had access to the trust's investment records throughout that period. To your knowledge, have there been any irregularities in the management of trust funds during that time? Fitch met this with the expression of a man sitting very still, in the middle of a river, and hoping the current changes direction. I have had no reason to suspect any irregularities. That is not what I asked. Wolfe's voice was gentle, which in my experience is when it is most dangerous. I asked whether, to your knowledge, irregularities exist. Your knowledge may encompass things you have chosen not to examine too closely. I resent the implication. Nevertheless. Wolfe waited. Fitch looked at his hands, then back up. There were periods when the accounting was complex. Howard liked creative financing. It was one of his strengths and occasionally one of his problems. After he died, I assume some irregularities in the record-keeping had been smoothed over as part of the estate process. He shifted in his seat. I did not look closely. I should have. Who managed the trust accounts after Howard Barrow's death? The estate attorney, primarily, and Celia. He said her name without looking at her. Celia had power of attorney and handled day-to-day administrative matters. Celia Barrow said, very quietly, Gerald. Mrs. Barrow, Wolfe said, turning to her with the same conversational ease. Your administrative access to the trust accounts during the period in question, how would you characterize it? Standard. Routine fiduciary oversight. Would you object to a full audit of the trust accounts for the past 8 years? I would require my attorney to be present before agreeing to anything of that. I'll take that as a conditional no, Wolfe said, and moved on. He turned to Marcus Dent, who had been sitting through the proceedings, with the expression of someone watching a building on a street he knows well, and hoping it's not his. Mr. Dent, you told Archie that Randolph had spoken to you about his research into the trust accounts approximately 3 days before his death. You did not share this with the police during their initial interviews. Marcus looked startled, then collected. I mentioned it generally. They didn't seem interested. You also told Archie that Randolph described finding a trail that had been, I believe the phrase was, cleaned. Tidied by someone who knew where to look. Wolfe paused. That is a very specific observation. Did Randolph give you any indication of which records had been cleaned, or who might have had the knowledge to do so? He said it had to be someone with financial expertise and internal access. He mentioned 2 names. He was hedging. He hadn't decided which one, but he said it was one of them. Marcus glanced across the room at Fitch, then at Celia Barrow. And those names, Wolfe said. Marcus took a breath. Fitch and Celia Barrow. He said one of them had been in the accounts, and the other one knew about it and hadn't said anything. The room adjusted to this, the way a room adjusts to a window being opened. A shift in pressure, an intake of breath. Kramer had stopped writing. He was watching Celia Barrow with the specific attention of a man recalibrating. Fitch said, "That's absurd." Celia Barrow said nothing. "Absurd," Wolfe repeated thoughtfully. A strong word. Stronger, certainly, than false or incorrect. People use absurd when they wish to dismiss a thing without engaging with it. He folded his hands. "Mr. Fitch, did you know about the embezzlement?" "No." "Did Randolph say anything at dinner, the last dinner, that suggested he was closing in on an answer?" "A beat. 1 beat too long. He asked about his father's business judgment." "Yes, you mentioned that. He asked whether you had ever had reason to doubt it." Wolfe was quiet for a moment. That is not a question a young man asks idly about his deceased father. It is a question that has a specific thing behind it. What did he know about his father's business judgment that prompted the question? "I don't know." "Consider more carefully." Fitch's jaw tightened. Howard occasionally authorized payments that were not standard, to consultants, to third parties. I questioned one or two of them over the years. He assured me they were legitimate. Were they? I believed they were. If those payments were in fact the mechanism by which trust funds were extracted, would that suggest that Howard Barrow himself was the source of the embezzlement, and that Celia Barrow, as the administrator of his estate, had both discovered this and concealed it? The silence this time was of a different quality altogether. It was the silence of something being understood. I watched Celia Barrow's face through it. She did not speak. She did not move. But something changed in the architecture of her expression. Some load-bearing element shifted, and the structure above it moved by a fraction. The embezzlement, Wolfe said, may not have been conducted by anyone currently in this room. It may have been conducted by Howard Barrow himself during his lifetime, for purposes unknown, payments to individuals, business dealings kept separate from the company's formal accounts. The question is not then, who stole the money? The question is, who knew that Howard Barrow had done so, and what they chose to do with that knowledge. He looked at Celia Barrow steadily. A sister who discovers that her brother's estate contains evidence of serious financial misconduct faces a choice. She can expose it, destroying the family's name, the company's reputation, and her own position. Or she can manage it, quietly, smoothly, for years. Celia Barrow said, in a voice stripped down to its structural minimum, "My brother was not a thief." "I did not say he was," Wolfe replied. "I said he may have made payments that are difficult to account for through standard channels. There is a range of explanations for such payments, not all of them criminal. But the concealment of them is another matter. When Randolph began to find evidence of those payments, he was not simply uncovering an embezzlement. He was uncovering something about his father. That is why the question at dinner was about his father's judgment. He was looking, I think, for reassurance, and he did not get it. Fitch said slowly, "He didn't get it because I didn't know what he was really asking." "Or because the answer would not have been reassuring," Wolfe said. "We will return to that." He turned to Eleanor Voss. She had been still throughout, the stillest person in the room, which in my experience is either a sign of innocence or extraordinary control. "Miss Voss, the note. Did Randolph ever speak to you about the possibility that he might be in danger?" "Once," she said. "About 2 weeks before he disappeared. He said he thought someone knew he was looking. He said he'd been careful, but some of the files he'd pulled had been accessed after him. Someone was tracking what he was tracking." "Did he say how he knew this?" "The access logs. The company record system keeps timestamps. He said a second set of timestamps appeared after his on several key files, a day or two after he'd looked at them." She paused. "He said it meant someone inside the company." "Inside the company," Wolfe repeated, and let that phrase occupy the room for a moment. Outside, a car passed on 35th Street. Fritz appeared briefly in the doorway, assessed the atmosphere, and withdrew without a sound. The afternoon had gone gray at the edges. Someone inside the company, Wolfe said again, was monitoring which files Randolph accessed. And that person had administrative access to the record system itself, the kind of access that would allow monitoring of user activity. He looked at Celia Barrow. "You have administrative oversight of the company's operations. Does that include the record system?" "I expect it does." He picked up his book from the desk, examined the spine, and set it down again, a gesture I recognized as his version of a full stop. "I have enough for now. Each of you will be available for further contact through Archie. Inspector Kramer may have his own questions." Kramer, who had accumulated several pages of notes in the expression of a man who has eaten something disagreeable and found it nourishing, stood up. "I have plenty of questions," he said, "starting with Mr. Fitch." He took Fitch into the hallway. The others began to gather themselves. Celia Barrow was last. She stood, straightened her jacket, and looked at Wolfe. "My brother," she said, "was not a thief." "No," Wolfe said. but he may have had dealings he was not proud of, and someone has killed his son to keep those dealings from seeing daylight. He met her eyes. If you know what those dealings were, Mrs. Barrow, now is the time to tell me. Not tomorrow. Now. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Come to my apartment this evening. I'll tell you what I know." "I do not go to apartments. Archie will come." She left without responding, which I took as agreement. I saw the others out, dealt with Kramer briefly in the hallway. He was his usual combination of grateful and resentful, and came back to find Wolfe in the position he adopts when the thinking has moved from preliminary to serious. Both hands flat on the arms of the chair, eyes fully closed, the faint vertical line between his eyebrows that means the machinery is engaged. I sat down and waited. After 6 minutes, he opened his eyes. "Go to Celia Barrow's apartment at 8 o'clock, he said. "Listen to everything. What she tells you will either clarify the case or complicate it. I am currently undecided, which I expect." "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking," he said, "that Howard Barrow, who has been dead for 6 years, may be the most important person in this case. And I am thinking that someone in that room today was far less surprised by certain revelations than they appeared to be." "Which one?" He picked up his book. "Bring me back everything she says. We will discuss it in the morning." I went upstairs to change my shirt and eat whatever Fritz had determined was appropriate for a man going to a Park Avenue apartment to extract a confession from a woman who may or may not have covered up her dead brother's financial crimes. It turned out to be poached salmon. Fritz always knows. Celia Barrow's apartment was on Park Avenue in the 70s, in a building that had doormen with the gravitas of senior diplomats, and an elevator with actual wood paneling. She received me in a sitting room that smelled of good furniture and cut flowers, and the particular kind of quiet that serious money purchases. She was in a dark dress, and had a glass of something amber on the table beside her chair that she was not drinking. She told me about her brother. Howard Barrow had been, by any external measure, a success, built the company from a regional manufacturer into a significant operation, raised his son after his wife's early death, accumulated a fortune that would have satisfied most men completely. But Howard Barrow had a secondary life, carefully maintained and expensive. Not scandalous in the tabloid sense. No affairs, no gambling, nothing colorful. His secondary life was political. Specifically, it was financial support, channeled through entities that were not easy to trace, to a series of political figures over the span of about 12 years. Not contributions, arrangements, payments for favorable regulatory treatment, for introductions, for specific decisions made in specific rooms. The kind of thing that carries a formal name in certain legal contexts, and the name is not complimentary. He believed he was buying stability, Celia said. Her voice had changed from the boardroom register she'd been using all day. This was older and more tired. He called it insurance. He told me once that every businessman of his generation paid into the system in one form or another. The difference was that he was careful about it. How careful? I asked. The payments went through 3 vehicles: a consulting arrangement with a company in Delaware, a small foundation he controlled, and a third account under a name that doesn't appear anywhere in the company's public filings. She picked up her glass and put it down without drinking. When he died, I found the records. All of them. I understood immediately what they were. "And you covered them," I said. "I managed them," she said, with the precision of someone who had spent 6 years building a verbal distinction. "I did not destroy them. I consolidated them into the trust's historical records in a way that made them contextually ambiguous, not obviously illegal, difficult to interpret without full context. Eleanor Voss interpreted them. Miss Voss is very capable," she said, without emotion, "more capable than I had estimated. And when Randolph started finding the same things, She was quiet for a moment. Randolph finding them was different. It was his father's reputation. I thought I could explain it to him, in time. I thought I could show him that what his father did was not, that it was the kind of thing. She stopped. I was wrong about what he would accept. "Mrs. Barrow," I said, "did you know Randolph was in danger?" She looked at me directly. "I did not know someone would kill him. I knew someone was nervous about his research." "Who?" "There is a man," she said slowly, "whose name does not appear in this story yet. A man named Carl Prentice. He was one of the recipients, you might say, of Howard's arrangements, a facilitator, a person who connected money to decisions for a fee." She paused. "When I was managing Howard's records after his death, Prentice contacted me. He said that certain records that Howard had kept as security, documentation of the arrangements, including Prentice's own role, needed to be destroyed. I refused. I told him they were already managed, that they posed no threat. He accepted that. For 6 years, he accepted it. But when Randolph started looking, Prentice contacted me again, about 3 weeks before Randolph disappeared. He said that if Randolph found those records and understood them, Prentice would face serious legal exposure. He wanted the records destroyed. I said it was too late. Randolph had already accessed the system. She set down her glass. He said he would handle it himself. I was very still. "And you did not warn Randolph?" The silence was its own answer. Celia Barrow looked at her hands, and for the first time since I had met her, she looked, not controlled, and not composed, but simply old. "I told myself he wouldn't do anything," she said. "I told myself Prentice was bluffing. I told myself that Randolph would find the records and come to me, and I would explain, and it would be managed." Her voice remained flat and careful. "I was wrong about all of it." I put down my pen and looked at her. She met my eyes. "Carl Prentice," I said. "Where is he?" "Prentice turned out to live in Connecticut, which I resent on principle. People who commit crimes in New York and then sleep in Connecticut have always struck me as getting an unreasonable geographical advantage. But he had an office in Midtown, on 49th Street, where he ran what presented itself as a government relations consultancy. 3 people worked there. The reception area had framed photographs of Prentice with political figures, going back 20 years. He was a compact man, mid-60s, with gray eyes that took in everything and gave nothing back, and the particular ease of a man who has always moved in rooms where information was the currency. I did not have an appointment. I arrived at 10 the next morning and told the receptionist that I was there on behalf of Nero Wolfe regarding the Barrow matter, and that Mr. Prentice should see me now or see Inspector Kramer this afternoon, and that I had a preference but no strong opinion. Prentice came out in 4 minutes. He took me into a conference room, closed the door, and sat down across from me with the expression of a man who has been expecting this conversation for 11 days and has had time to prepare. "You know why I'm here," I said. "I know who you represent," he said. "Nero Wolfe is not a man one ignores." "Smart. Did you know Randolph Barrow?" "I knew his father. I met Randolph twice, briefly, at company events in the years after Howard died." "Did you arrange to meet him recently?" Pause. "No." "Did you contact anyone connected to him recently?" Longer pause. "I contacted Celia Barrow approximately 3 weeks ago regarding a business matter." "The business matter being Howard Barrow's records." He looked at me steadily. "I'm not sure what you're referring to." "Mr. Prentice," I said, "I am an informal man in an informal situation, and I will stay that way for approximately another minute. After that, I will take what Celia Barrow told me last night, and what Randolph Barrow's own notes indicate, to Inspector Kramer of the NYPD, who is currently working a homicide investigation that has your name as an unexamined thread. After that, you'll be having a different kind of conversation in a different kind of room." I folded my hands on the table. "Did you tell Celia Barrow you would handle the situation yourself?" He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I counted it. "I told her," he said finally, that I would speak to Randolph, that I would explain the context of certain historical arrangements in a way that would make clear they were a matter of settled history and posed no current legal issue. He paused. I contacted Randolph Barrow by phone on the Thursday before his death. I asked to meet him. Did you meet him? He declined. He said he had all the information he needed and would be taking appropriate action after his birthday. He looked at me. I did not harm that young man. I had no reason to harm him. The legal exposure he represented was to me, yes, but it was manageable. Embarrassing, potentially costly, but manageable. I have lawyers for that. Then who did harm him? He said with the tone of a man providing information as a transaction. On the Monday that Randolph died, I had him followed. I hired a man to keep eyes on him. I wanted to know if he was meeting with lawyers, with journalists, how active he was. My man reported that Randolph left the restaurant that evening, alone, on foot. He walked 2 blocks north. He stopped on the sidewalk. He appeared to receive a phone call. He then walked toward the garage. He paused. He went in voluntarily. My man assumed he was getting a car. He waited. He did not see Randolph come out. But he also saw someone else go in, approximately 3 minutes before Randolph, and come out approximately 10 minutes later. Description, I said. Average height. Wearing a dark coat. My man's vantage point was poor. He was across the street. He met my eyes. He said the figure moved purposefully, not looking around, knew where they were going. Someone who knew Randolph would be there. Someone who set up the meeting, the phone call. He leaned forward slightly. Randolph didn't walk into that garage by accident, Mr. Goodwin. Someone called him and told him to. I drove back across the city in the early afternoon, through traffic that was doing its usual impression of deliberate obstruction. I had a thread that was pulling in a direction I hadn't fully expected, and it needed to reach Wolfe. The phone call. Someone who had Randolph's number and knew his location. Someone who could get him to walk into a parking garage voluntarily at 10:15 on a Monday night. Someone he trusted. Back at the brownstone, I laid everything out for Wolfe during the 4 o'clock session. He had come down from the plant rooms and was in the office with a beer, which meant he was in a phase of active but unhurried thinking. He listened to the full account of Celia Barrow's revelations and the conversation with Prentice without interruption, which is always a sign that he's absorbing rather than reacting. When I finished, he sat for a while. Howard Barrow, he said at last, was making illicit payments to political facilitators. His sister knew. She concealed the records rather than destroy them, which suggests she intended to retain them as leverage, or simply could not bring herself to erase her brother's history entirely. Prentice, whose exposure was greatest, made contact with her when Randolph's research became threatening. She told Prentice it was too late. Prentice then contacted Randolph directly. Randolph refused the meeting, and Randolph died. But Prentice says he didn't do it. Prentice says he didn't do it, Wolfe agreed. He also says he had Randolph followed, which he would not have admitted unless he calculated that admitting it was less damaging than having me find out another way. And his account of the evening, the phone call, the deliberate entry, is consistent with the evidence and inconsistent with a crime organized by Prentice. How so? If Prentice had arranged the murder, he would not have had his own operative on the scene as a witness. He is a careful man. He would not create a witness to his own crime. The operative's presence suggests Prentice was genuinely monitoring the situation, not controlling it. So who made the phone call? Wolfe picked up his beer and considered the glass rather than me, which is his way of thinking out loud through an intermediary. The phone call was made by someone Randolph trusted enough to comply with. At 10:15 on a Monday evening, after dinner with Fitch, he received a call that induced him to enter a parking garage rather than proceed to his apartment. The call was not from a stranger. It was not threatening. A threatened man does not walk calmly into an enclosed space. He went to meet someone, I said. Someone he thought was safe. Yes. Now, who in the geography of this case does Randolph Barrow trust? He set down the glass. Not his aunt, by his own written account. Not Fitch. He was suspicious of Fitch. Prentice he refused. That leaves two people who occupy the trusted category. Eleanor Voss, with whom he was emotionally close, and Marcus Dent, who was his closest friend. I had been circling around this for the last hour and hadn't wanted to land on it. Marcus Dent, I said. He knew what Randolph was looking for. He knew the research was advancing. He knew about the embezzlement findings. He knew, Wolfe said, because Randolph told him. The question is what else Marcus Dent knew, and from whom. You think he had a separate source of information? I think it is possible. Examine what we know of him. Young architect, mid-20s, close friend since Columbia. No obvious financial connection to Barrow Manufacturing. No apparent motive of his own. He paused. And yet he waited 11 days. 11 days during which he believed his closest friend might be in danger, before someone else's investigation brought him to this brownstone. He did not go to the police. He did not pursue it himself. He waited. He said he mentioned it to the police generally. People who are genuinely frightened for a friend do not mention things generally. They are specific. They are insistent. They make themselves inconvenient until they are heard. Wolfe's eyes were at the middle distance. Marcus Dent was not frightened. He was watchful. There is a difference. I let that settle. It settled unpleasantly. You think he's connected to Prentice, or to the payments? Some kind of link we haven't found. I think the phone call to Randolph that Monday evening is the hinge on which this case turns, Wolfe said. Find me the phone call. Find the number it came from. That will tell us more than another conversation. I called a man I know, not a policeman, not quite a private investigator. Someone who exists in the useful space between those categories, and whose relationship with telecommunications infrastructure is flexible in productive ways. He said he'd have something by morning. Then I went back to my notes and looked at everything again, from the beginning. Marcus Dent, 27 years old, architecture firm on the west side, known Randolph since Columbia. Arrived 20 minutes early for an appointment he hadn't been asked to be early for. Hands flat on his knees when Wolfe mentioned the note. Not frightened, watchful. Who was he watching for? I thought about the secondary account, the payments, Howard Barrow, routing money through 3 vehicles to people who made political things happen, Prentice as the facilitator. And then, I thought about what a facilitator does. He connects money to decisions. He is an intermediary. He is not the only intermediary. I pulled out my notebook and wrote, does Dent have any connection to political work, government relations, any of the entities Howard Barrow used? Then I wrote, who introduced Dent and Randolph at Columbia? Then I put down the pen and thought about the note again. Don't trust Aunt Celia either. Randolph had written that, either in genuine fear and forewarning, or someone had written it to cast suspicion in 2 directions and give themselves room to operate. If someone had written it to cast suspicion, if Randolph was already dead when it was mailed, then the person who mailed it knew his handwriting well enough to replicate it convincingly, or had a pre-written document from Randolph himself. A close friend, a trusted friend, someone Randolph might have written to before any of this started, in a context that could be repurposed. I picked up the phone and called Marcus Dent. He answered on the second ring. Mr. Dent, I said, did Randolph ever write to you? Letters, notes, the handwritten kind? Silence. Then, why? It's relevant to the investigation. Did he? A pause that ran several seconds too long. We exchanged notes sometimes, when we were at Columbia. It was a thing we did, old-fashioned we thought it was. He stopped. Do you have any of those notes? Some. Yes. I'd like you to bring them to the brownstone tomorrow morning, I said, whatever you have. Another pause. I can do that. Good, I said. 9 o'clock. I hung up and sat for a moment. Then I went to find Wolfe, who had moved to the dining room for whatever Fritz had prepared, and told him about the notes. He stopped cutting his veal. He looked at me. Handwritten notes. From a decade ago. In sufficient quantity that a specific phrase could be extracted and reproduced in context. That's the thought, I said. Wolfe set down his knife. The note Celia Barrow brought us, he said, was not written in fear. It was written in habit. Old habit. A familiar voice addressing a familiar recipient in familiar terms. He picked up his knife again. Sit down, Archie. Eat something. We have most of it now. Tomorrow we will have the rest. I sat down. Fritz brought me a plate. Outside, the city went on being the city, and somewhere in it, a young architect was deciding what to say in the morning. I was willing to bet it wouldn't be the truth. Not yet. But by tomorrow afternoon, it would be. I have watched Wolfe build traps for people over many years, and the thing that always strikes me is how little they look like traps until they've already closed. He doesn't bluff. Not exactly. He assembles. He takes the pieces that are established and arranges them into a shape that leaves only one space unfilled. And then he waits for the person who fits that space to step into it without quite understanding what they've done. The morning of the second Thursday began with two developments. The first was the phone record. My contact came through at 8:15 with the information I needed. A call had been placed to Randolph Barrow's mobile number at 10:22 on the evening of his death, duration 4 minutes and 11 seconds, from a prepaid number activated 3 days prior and never used again. The cell tower that registered the call placed it within a half-mile radius of a specific block on the west side of Manhattan, the block where Marcus Dent's architecture firm was located. I brought this to Wolfe at 8:30. He was on his second cup of coffee and the tail end of his breakfast. He read the information on my notepad, nodded once, and said, "Good, let him bring the notes." Marcus Dent arrived at 9 o'clock precisely, carrying a manila envelope. He was dressed in his work clothes, jacket, open collar, and looked like a man who had made a decision and was carrying it quietly. I showed him into the office and left him with Wolfe while I stood near the door. "Mr. Dent," Wolfe said, "thank you for coming. Please set the envelope on Archie's desk." Marcus did so. He sat down in the red leather chair, the client's chair, which was either unconscious or pointed, and looked at Wolfe with the steadiness I'd noted before. Watchful, controlled. "I want to tell you something," Marcus said, "before you go through those." "Please," Wolfe said. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen the way it did." He said it without preamble and without softening, as though he'd been rehearsing the sentence and had decided this was the only version worth delivering. "I want you to know that." "All right," Wolfe said. "Tell me how it did happen." Marcus Dent looked at his hands for a moment, then up at Wolfe. "I met Carl Prentice through a family connection when I was 23. He offered me consulting work, political research, background on regulatory matters. It paid well. I did it for 2 years. He paused. During that time I worked on several files related to Barrow manufacturing. I didn't know it at the time. The company names were obscured. I found out later, when I recognized references in documents, that Howard Barrow's firm was involved. "When you met Randolph at Columbia," Wolfe said, "was that arranged?" A long pause. "Not directly. Prentice knew I was at Columbia. He knew Randolph was there. He suggested that cultivating a friendship might be useful over time." He closed his eyes briefly. "I went to that first party intending to meet him. But he was genuinely my friend. That part wasn't manufactured. I need you to believe that." "I will neither believe nor disbelieve it for the moment," Wolfe said. "Continue." "When Randolph started his research, Prentice contacted me. He said that Randolph was getting close to records that would expose not just Howard's payments, but Prentice's role, and the roles of several other people whose names were in Howard's documentation. He said I needed to find out how close Randolph was and what he intended to do. And you obliged." I talked to Randolph. I let him tell me what he'd found. I reported back to Prentice. He said it flatly, without decoration. I am not proud of it, but I did it. The note, Wolfe said. The note mailed to Celia Barrow the day after Randolph's death. Marcus looked up. Randolph wrote to me regularly, from the time we were at Columbia. I had a box of his letters. When Prentice told me what he was going to do, what he had done, he told me to use one of Randolph's old notes, to create a postmarked record that Randolph had been alive and concerned the day after his death, to buy time, to confuse the timeline. His voice was very even. I selected sentences from 2 different letters, photographed them, and Prentice's people reconstructed the note. Prentice killed Randolph. Prentice arranged it. He didn't do it personally. There's a man named... He stopped. There's a man. I don't know his name. Prentice uses him. I know he exists. Wolfe was quiet for a moment. His hands were flat on the desk. Why are you telling me this? Because I've been trying to decide for 11 days whether I'm a person who does this, Marcus said, and I've decided I'm not. He looked directly at Wolfe. I'll tell the police everything I've told you. I'll give them the name Prentice uses. I'll testify, whatever it costs me. Wolfe looked at him for a long moment. It will cost you considerably. I know. He didn't flinch. Very well. Wolfe reached for his desk phone. Archie, call Inspector Kramer. He arrived in 22 minutes, which is fast for Kramer, which told me he had been waiting for a reason to move. He listened to Marcus Dent for 40 minutes, took his own notes, made his own calls, and by mid-afternoon, there were 2 men in handcuffs. Prentice and a man named Victor Slade, whose name I won't forget because his history turned out to be the kind that makes your morning coffee taste different. Prentice tried for 30 minutes to construct a version of events in which he was a peripheral figure. Kramer let him construct it, and then took it apart, piece by piece, with the calm brutality of a man who has been waiting for this specific conversation. By 4 o'clock, Kramer called me to say they had a full statement, and that Slade had confirmed the arranged killing. I went back to Wolfe's office and told him. He said, "Good," and returned to his Byzantine economics. There was, I felt, one more conversation to be had, not by Wolfe, by me. I went back to the brownstone's front steps, sat down in the afternoon air, and thought about Randolph Barrow. 26 years old, 3 weeks from his birthday, careful and serious, and stubborn about being on time. He had found something true about his father, and was trying to decide what to do with it. He had written frightened notes to an aunt he was unsure of, and a friend he trusted completely, not knowing that the trust was the thing that would kill him. Sometimes the case resolves cleanly, and the feeling that comes with it is clean too. The gathering was at 4 o'clock on Friday. Wolfe had requested it. Kramer had agreed, with the specific combination of annoyance and cooperation that marks his understanding that the brownstone frequently produces results his department cannot replicate through conventional methods. Celia Barrow came. Gerald Fitch came. Eleanor Voss came. Marcus Dent came, flanked by an attorney Kramer had arranged for him, which told you something about the deals being negotiated in the hours between his confession and this moment. The room had the quality of a space where something final was about to happen. Fritz had brought coffee and left it on the sideboard and quietly removed himself. The afternoon light was strong through the windows. Wolfe was behind his desk in the yellow chair, hands folded, looking at each of them in turn, with the expression of a man who has organized his thoughts into a structure he finds satisfying. "I will be brief," he said, which in Wolfe's language means he will be thorough but will not repeat himself. "I will state what occurred, and why, and who is responsible, and then Inspector Kramer will proceed as he sees fit." No one spoke. Randolph Barrow was killed by a man named Victor Slade, contracted by Carl Prentice. This is established by Slade's own statement, by physical evidence at the scene, consistent with Slade's presence, and by financial records connecting Prentice to Slade that are now in the possession of the police. He paused. But a murder of this specificity does not begin with the instrument, it begins with the reason. He looked at Celia Barrow. She met his gaze and held it. Howard Barrow, over a period of approximately 12 years, made illicit payments to political facilitators, men whose business it was to connect private money to public decisions. The total transferred is yet to be fully calculated, but it runs to several $million. These payments were not theft. Howard Barrow used his own funds, routed through trust vehicles he controlled. They were, however, seriously illegal under several federal statutes. Carl Prentice was the primary facilitator. He received the largest share of those payments and bears the largest legal exposure. Howard Barrow, Gerald Fitch said, in a voice that had aged 10 years in 2 days, was doing this while I was his partner? He was. You were not involved, to the best of the evidence available. Howard Barrow was scrupulous about keeping this separate from the company's formal operations. Whether this represents consideration for you, or simply self-protection, is a question I will leave to your own judgment. Wolfe turned back to the room. When Howard Barrow died, his sister discovered the records. She did not destroy them. She consolidated them, embedded them within the trust's historical documentation, in a form that was contextually ambiguous. Her stated reason was that she could not bring herself to erase her brother's history entirely. The unstated reason, or perhaps an equally true additional reason, is that retained records are retained leverage. The people named in those records had reason to behave carefully so long as Celia Barrow held the documentation. Celia Barrow said nothing. She was past performing. For 6 years this arrangement held. Then Randolph Barrow began his research. He was methodical and intelligent, and he found the trail. He also found that the trail had been partially cleaned, that someone had accessed the same records after him, and removed or obscured specific details. Wolfe paused. That was not Celia Barrow. She had no reason to further obscure records she had already managed. That was Prentice, who had maintained a connection to the company's administrative systems through a contact he had cultivated years earlier. Celia Barrow looked up. What contact? Marcus Dent, Wolfe said, who had been recruited by Prentice when he was 23, and who met Randolph Barrow at Columbia with Prentice's knowledge and at Prentice's suggestion. The friendship that developed was genuine. Mr. Dent has confirmed this himself, and I believe it is true. But the initial contact was arranged. He looked at Marcus, who had his eyes on the floor. Mr. Dent provided Prentice with information about the progress of Randolph's research. He did not know, or did not allow himself to fully consider, where that information would lead. Eleanor Voss, who had been still and quiet throughout, said quietly, "He knew Randolph trusted him." Wolfe glanced at her. Yes, he knew. When Prentice concluded that Randolph's research could not be stopped by ordinary means, that Randolph had refused a direct meeting and intended to pursue the matter fully after his birthday, he arranged the murder. Wolfe folded his hands more firmly. The method was elegant in its simplicity. A phone call to Randolph's number from a prepaid device placed from the vicinity of Marcus Dent's firm. Whether by Dent or by a third party using his location as cover, the investigation will determine. Randolph, trusting the caller, walked to a pre-arranged meeting point, the parking garage on 54th Street. Victor Slade was already inside. One blow, wallet and watch taken as misdirection, Slade walked out. The room was very quiet. The note, Wolfe continued, was fabricated from fragments of Randolph's genuine correspondence, which Mr. Dent had retained from years of friendship. It was mailed by arrangement to Celia Barrow the following day, postmarked from Midtown, designed to establish a false timeline and simultaneously cast suspicion in two directions. The note succeeded in the latter, while failing in the former. We established the true timeline through other means. But the note did bring Mrs. Barrow to this office, which set the investigation in motion. He looked at the room. Carl Prentice killed Randolph Barrow to protect himself from the legal consequences of 12 years of influence peddling. He used a young man's trust as the mechanism, and he chose to act with 19 days remaining before the problem resolved itself irrevocably. He paused. He was, in the end, less patient than the situation required. He calculated that acting was safer than waiting. Impatience is frequently the error that breaks a carefully constructed arrangement. Gerald Fitch, who had been absorbing this in visible stages, said, if Randolph had simply waited 3 weeks, he would have had access to everything, Wolfe agreed. Full control of the trust, full capacity to commission a formal audit, full legal standing to pursue the matter. Prentice knew this. The 19 days were not a comfort to Prentice. They were a deadline. Kramer had his notepad out, but hadn't looked at it for the last several minutes. He was watching Wolfe, with the expression he reserves for moments when his professional pride is in active conflict with his grudging respect. Slade's already in custody, he said. We're working on the phone confirmation now. Prentice's financial records are going to take time. They will be comprehensive when you have them, Wolfe said. Howard Barrow was meticulous, and Prentice was meticulous in turn. 12 years of illicit payments leave a detailed record if you know how to read the architecture. He looked at Kramer. Miss Voss will be a useful resource. Her analytical abilities are considerable. She found the trail that everyone else missed. Eleanor Voss looked at Wolfe briefly and looked away. It was not acknowledgement of a compliment. It was something more complicated. The expression of someone calculating what finding the trail had cost. Mrs. Barrow, Wolfe said, you will face questions regarding your management of the trust records, and your failure to disclose a known threat to your nephew's safety. I cannot predict the legal outcome. I can say that your decision to come to this office, however many things you withheld in that first conversation, set in motion the process that produced these results. That is not nothing. Celia Barrow looked at him. It doesn't bring him back. No, Wolfe said. It does not. The room was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the brownstone held its usual afternoon stillness. The tick of the old clock in the hall, the faint sound of Fritz in the kitchen, the muted noise of 35th Street going about its business. Kramer stood up. He had things to do, which is how Kramer registers completion, not by saying it's over, but by moving toward the next necessary action. He took a brief statement from Marcus Dent's attorney, nodded at Wolfe, looked at me once, and left. The others followed in stages, like a tide going out. The last to leave was Eleanor Voss. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked back at Wolfe. He was building the case to expose it cleanly, she said. He didn't want to hurt the company or the family name. He just wanted it to be right. I know, Wolfe said. He would have succeeded, she said. Yes, Wolfe's voice was as measured as always, but something in the timbre of it was different. Quieter. He would have. She left. I sat down in the red leather chair and looked at the man across the desk from me, who had, over the past several days, not left the brownstone, not raised his voice, not employed any instrument more dramatic than logic and patience, and had managed to produce a result that had eluded the police for 11 days, and would likely elude them for considerably longer without his intervention. How long did you know it was Prentice? I asked. I suspected an external actor by the second day, Wolfe said. The embezzlement, on reflection, was inconsistent with Celia Barrow or Fitch as principal. Mrs. Barrow had concealed records, not stolen funds, a preserver's instinct, not a thief's. Fitch had no administrative access to the relevant accounts. The payments Eleanor Voss identified predated his involvement in trust management. Someone outside the family had controlled an information channel into the company for years. That pattern is not improvised. It is constructed. He picked up his book examined the page he'd been on, set it down again. Dent concerned me from the second conversation. His knowledge was slightly too specific, and his grief was slightly too managed. A man who has lost his closest friend is not watchful. He is lost. Mr. Dent was watchful. And the note. The note was the first thing that didn't fit. Randolph Barrow was an educated, careful young man facing a genuine threat. If he had written a genuine warning, he would have been specific. Names, records, locations. Instead, the note was atmospheric, suggestive. It pointed in two directions without committing to either. That is not how a frightened person writes. That is how someone writes when they are crafting a document rather than sending a message. He finally opened his book. The handwriting confirmed it was Randolph's. The construction confirmed it was not. Prentice will lawyer up, I said. He will, extensively. But Slade has already turned. And financial records are patient witnesses. They do not forget, and they do not negotiate. He turned a page. The federal dimensions of this case will occupy a great many people for a great many months. Political facilitators rarely confine themselves to a single client. I thought about that. 12 years of payments, multiple facilitators, multiple recipients. Howard Barrow was dead, but the people he had paid decisions from were not. The web that Randolph had been pulling on was likely larger than any of us had estimated in the first conversation, with a woman in pearls and a prepared story. Well, I said, at least Kramer will have something to do. Wolfe made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite a grunt, but existed comfortably somewhere between the two. He will be insufferable about it for months. He's insufferable in the best of times. True. Fritz appeared in the doorway. Mr. Wolfe, dinner will be in 1 hour. The guinea hen requires 20 additional minutes. Thank you, Fritz. Fritz withdrew. I sat for another minute in the red leather chair, looking at the room, the books, the globe, the orchids on the shelf, the yellow light of late afternoon filling the space where half a dozen frightened and compromised people had sat 2 days ago, telling pieces of the truth and hoping the pieces they left out were the important ones. They never are. That's the thing about Wolfe's office. You can walk in with a story and walk out with something that looks like one, but the room has a way of holding on to what's real. Randolph Barrow had been 26 years old, with 19 days and $43 million, and a father whose dealings he was trying to understand before he inherited the consequences. He had trusted the wrong person and the right person at the wrong time, and he had been careful and serious and stubborn about punctuality, and none of it had been enough. The case was closed. It sat on me the way some cases do. I stood up, put on my jacket, and thought about going to get a drink somewhere on the west side where no one would ask me about anything. Then I thought about the salmon Fritz had made on Wednesday, and the guinea hen that was currently happening in the kitchen, and I sat back down. Wolfe, I said. He said without looking up. Did you know from the beginning that the client was holding something back? He turned a page. Archie, they are always holding something back. Does that ever bother you? He considered this with the seriousness he gives to questions that seem simple and aren't. It would bother me if they told me everything at the outset. There would be nothing left to find. The guinea hen was in the oven. The orchids on the shelf were doing whatever orchids do in the late afternoon light, which as far as I can tell is simply the thing they do best, which is exist beautifully and without apology in the specific conditions they require. Outside, New York went about its business. Inside, the case was over. There is, I have found, no better place to be at the end of a bad week than in a room where someone is reading and something good is cooking. I stayed where I was and let the evening come on. The end.